Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA, and we're examining this Kim Walsh situation, the jailed clerk from down in Rowan County in Kentucky. A lot of people talking about that today. They're trying to figure it out. With us this morning is Bryan Walsh, who's the founder and president of the Civil Rights Research Center. He has an op-ed in The Hill today, or actually yesterday, praising the IRS Chief Koskinen for his protections of civil and religious liberties. But where does that stand right now? Can you retain your religious liberty and still do your job for the federal government? We asked that question of Bryan Walsh this morning, who joins us here on the Gary Sutton Show. Bryan, an honor to have you on the show. Good morning to you.
Hey, thanks, Gary. It's good to be on.
Bryan, tell me a little bit about your take on this whole thing, because it's interesting. I can see a little bit of both sides, even though I agree with someone keeping their rights. I don't think that your rights leave you at the doorstep of your job, and yet at the same time, we've had a decision made by the Supreme Court back in June that we have gay marriage allowed in this country, and we have a lady that says, not on my watch you don't, and because of my particular beliefs. So where does it all stand?
Well, basically, she's been put in a position between a rock and a hard place, and it's really up to others, those in government, to make accommodation for her. You certainly want to make sure that these licenses are issued, and so if she's in a position where she feels like she has the authority and has to make the decision for her entire organization, her government organization, and can't do it, then really it's the job of the legislature to get in and say, here's how we're going to do it, and here's how we're going to protect religious freedom at the same time. So it's not a zero-sum question. In fact, even before the Supreme Court had made the Obergefell decision about same-sex marriage, you had states that had protections for religious freedom in their same-sex marriage laws, like Delaware, for example. So in Delaware, their law, which was enacted before the same-sex marriage decision, it permitted justices of the peace and judges to choose to solemnize only those marriages they chose to. So you put the government officials in a position where the services are being offered and they are being provided to the people who want them, that is, getting a marriage license. At the same time, you're protecting religious conscience. The problem is that the courts have not done us any favors by, instead of allowing this to work out in the political process so that we ended up having protections put in place, like in the 12 states that adopted same-sex marriage through democratic processes, the courts basically, really bypassed that whole process and gave us the rights without giving us the protection. So she's really in a difficult position, and at the same time, someone needs to issue those licenses.
Now, what's really interesting here is they're keeping her in jail ostensibly until she is willing to do that. And so now you have 5 of the 6 deputy clerks, other than her son, who's who's 6th, who says, I will do it. We're not real happy about doing it in some cases, but we will issue those. They started doing that today, allegedly. But she says, I will negate that because I am the chief clerk, and when I get out, I will negate that. And, of course, the fact is they're saying she's staying in until she does it. So you're right, a rock and a hard place is exactly where we're at right now. So what is the answer here? In other words, she's saying, in my elected job, I am not going to change my mind. And they're saying, well, then you're staying in prison.
So the point is they get to the legislature to take action. I mean, it's very difficult for her right now. People of conscience sometimes have to take a hard stand and have to suffer the consequences of it.
And you admire that. I mean, you admire when people feel so strongly about their personal views that they're willing to do that, and yet that doesn't lead. I mean, the final decision then goes somewhere else unless one side backs down.
Correct. And so really you need the legislature to step in, and they need to make a decision about how you're going to handle religious liberty, much like North Carolina did recently. North Carolina enacted a law that made sure that clerks' religious liberty would be protected and the licenses would be issued. And it's possible to do that. And unfortunately, the court in June made this decision when many of these state legislatures are out of session. In fact, almost all of them are out of session. So, the states have to scramble to try to catch up with what the Supreme Court has done. And that's going to be a lot of work, and some people are going to suffer in the meantime, as we're seeing right now.
Is there room? You've raised a great question here, Bryan, and we're talking again with Bryan Walsh this morning, who is the founder and president of the Civil Rights Research Center. Is there room for our rights protected by the, 10 Amendments, the Bill of Rights, and room for law as it's being practiced right now in the country in the same place at the same time?
Well, there is. I mean, it's not easy. It takes political will, and you have to make sure that people are well educated about it, which is part of what I'm after, is to make sure that people understand that you don't have to have a scorched earth victory on either side. We can indeed live in peaceful coexistence, whether you like that term or not. That's the reality that we're striving for, and 12 states had enacted same-sex marriage through democratic processes, either through their state legislatures or through a voter referendum. That's in Maine, before the same-sex marriage decision. And there was relatively few conflicts between religious freedom and same-sex marriage, largely because you had these protections in those same-sex marriage laws for religious freedom. So you can do it. It's just going to take work. It's going to take effort. And if either side is bent on getting a flat-out victory and saying we're not going to recognize, the same-sex marriage law, or we're going to basically wipe all dissenters off the board on the other side, it's going to be a lot more difficult. And we need to have those who are in the middle who recognize that we need to make accommodations for the new rights while not eliminating any of our existing rights. There's no reason to eliminate religious freedom in order to accommodate same-sex marriage.
You could be talking a foreign language, though, in the present-day mood that we're in the country, because it seems to me and maybe there's a lot more of you than we believe. We are guided right now by perceptions.
Right.
We're guided by perceptions. In other words, you think everybody thinks that there's a scorched earth policy. In other words, I have to make you believe in what I believe in, so I have to win and you have to lose, and then you come over to my side. And that's kind of where we've been. We see it on a political level, and we're seeing it many times on the social level, where people are saying, you will believe, for example, you will not only accept gay marriage, but you will like it. Okay, and so then we cross over into the rights kind of level there, and so it's an all or nothing kind of proposition, as opposed to a more reasoned look to protect everybody in this whole thing that you're proposing.
Right. Well, I think that's absolutely true. We've seen polling that shows that about 75% of Americans feel that the conversation is being improperly dominated by the extremes. So that's 75%. Now, it turns out that the people at the extremes tend to be the most active and the most vocal. And a lot of people who are more centrist feel like, it's kind of a dirty, nasty business, I don't want to get involved in it. But if they don't get involved and educated and vote and speak up, then you will have it dominated by people at the extremes. And it is difficult to engage in these issues, but you have to be able to talk with your neighbors. You have to be able to talk to your school board members, to your whoever else it is that you're trying to influence. And that's part of the nature of our system. Our system believes that each person has an influence on the political system, on our governmental system. That's popular sovereignty. And if people choose not to exercise that, well, then they're going to get the government that they deserve, which is it will be dominated by the extremes. So that's where we're at today. We've had a long history of moderating these divisions, especially over things that can be as volatile as religion, by making sure that we protect people's opinions, we protect their beliefs, regardless of whether we agree with them or not, with the only limitation being that if they engage in, inherently wrongful conduct like murder, rape, robbery, assault, battery under the name of religion, theft, embezzlement, you can't do that. It doesn't matter if that's your religion. That's inherently wrongful conduct. We don't allow that. But short of that, we've allowed people to have these freedoms, and that has led to one of the most peaceful societies, probably the most peaceful society in the history of the world, even though we have this great religious diversity. And we need to maintain that.
And a society that generally has, particularly valued the rule of law. And I posed something the other day. Someone said, well, the president doesn't carry out the law. He lets, sanctuary cities off the hook. He abides by the laws he wants to. He didn't go after, the DOMA thing, the Defense of Marriage Act. He didn't support that. He eventually supported gay marriage. He makes rules by going around Congress, even on the international level. So, there's a guy that gets away with it. He's not in jail like Kim Davis, and yet at the same time, he's not upholding the Constitution and really doing what he's supposed to do about law. And yet, we look at Kim Davis, and I got in the doghouse with some people the other day because I said, well, here's a lady who is exercising her freedom of religion, which she's doing here. And she's saying, this is what I believe in. And, of course, you have a lot of people who run off and say, well, she's married 4 times. She had 2 kids out of wedlock. That doesn't matter. The fact is she declares what her beliefs are here, and we must accept those. If she's born again, that's so be it. So I don't look at all that other diversion stuff. And yet, at the same time, she says, but my interpretation is more important now than the interpretation by the Supreme Court. And so now we get into another whole area of, okay, is law brought about by the legislature the same as in essence, law, even though we don't call it that, brought about by the decisions of the Supreme Court. So we've got all these other subtopics going on right here, don't we?
Right, we definitely do. And, one of the things I think that people get kind of wrapped around the axle about and confused is that we don't have to agree with a person on their beliefs.
No, we don't.
In order to protect them. In fact, if that were the basis to say, well, their beliefs are correct, therefore we'll protect them, then you wouldn't need freedom of religion. You just have the majority rule on everything. You wouldn't need freedom of speech. You just have the majority rule on everything. Say, we like this speech, we don't like that speech, etc. So even if we disagree with Kim Davis about the way that she's operating, even if we think that her stand is not the right way to go about it, I'm talking about just from a moral and ethical standpoint. Sure. That still is something that we want to try to figure out a way to protect. Now, if she has a legal duty and she can't avoid that, this is where the courts have put her in a position where, well, the legal process has to basically work its way out, and you can't violate a court order in that context. It's much like the civil rights movement in the 1960s, many times in the 1950s and 1960s. Many times, the civil rights movement was violating legitimate court orders and ended up getting themselves in trouble. Now, they were in the
long run, by doing it in a nonviolent way, many of them went to jail. Martin Luther King, right at the head of the line, they got some of those laws that had been lawful, quote unquote, and people saw them for what they were, the Jim Crow laws, for example, and they got them changed. And so that was the way of doing it. It was by a peaceful protest and going out there and doing what you were allowed to do, peaceable assembly, and yet at the same time it was opposed to laws that turned out to be wrong.
Absolutely. In fact, I have a good East Asian friend who is an advocate for an East Asian religion, and one of the things that he tells his constituents is that we can't do our job to advocate for you unless you live out your faith courageously. And I think that's true for all people of faith. All people of faith have to be in a position of living out their faith courageously, taking the hard knocks. The civil rights movement suffered all kinds of things, and that's indeed what brought them the moral authority to be able to change things. So, unfortunately, we sometimes get into that position. Law can't fix everything, and law doesn't always come along in time. And Kim Davis is in that position. And as we said, you still have to obey the law in that context or pay the consequences. So it's really a question of how do we move forward on this? How do we make sure that we continue to make the rule of law accommodate people who have this First Amendment right that sometimes is not being protected these days to believe and act upon those beliefs? And it's a hard thing to do, but that's what government's all about.
Brian, when we come back, I want to ask you a question. Where do my rights end and another's begin when they intermingle? In other words, Kim Davis is saying, well, I have the right to say I am going by the supreme judge of the world, which you mentioned the other day, and this is a heaven or hell decision for me, and so I can't, in good faith, give you a license. You can go somewhere else. And, of course, then the people on the other side say, well, that means you don't want gays or lesbians here, which I'm not sure that's what it means, but that's what you could, ascertain out of that. So the point is, do my rights, and we often understood rights by our founding fathers, and they came up with the Bill of Rights, to be rights with responsibility. So the rights also were rights that were given to us with the idea that we weren't going to infringe on others' rights to practice their life in the same way or a different way. And so where do mine end, and where do the people who are believing in same-sex marriage here begin? We're going to ask you that question when we come back. Bryan Walsh is the founder and president of the Civil Rights Research Center, and I'm really enjoying this conversation because we get inside all the topics and subtopics related to Kim Davis, one of the more interesting cases of the week, and it's right here on the Gary Sutton Show on News Radio 910 WSBA. We'll be back with you and Brian right after this. Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA, and we are with Bryan Walsh this morning, the founder and president of the Civil Rights Research Center. Really interesting conversation here, and we're talking about the Kim Walsh situation, the county clerk in Rowan County who will not issue same-sex marriage licenses, although her staff is doing it today because, well, she's in jail, okay? So where do my rights... in this case, she's saying I'm appealing to the supreme judge of the world, kind of the old Declaration of Independence thing. Where do her rights end with regard to religion here? Does it end when she encroaches on someone else's rights to have a same-sex marriage license? And someone told me yesterday, well, that's not a right. Well, according to the Supreme Court, yeah, you kind of can do that now. Where does that end and stop? Or where does it begin right now, I guess is what I'm asking you, Brian.
Well, and it's not, as you know, it's not an easy answer. It's not black and white. And a lot of people like to frame it in the way what they will generally do is take a right that they consider to be supreme, whether it's let's just say the right to.
Yeah, I'm not framing it that way. I'm inquiring because I'm really not sure of the answer here. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm basically kind of exploding the way that it's typically done, and that is that people will take a right which they seem to be the supreme or paramount right, and then suggest that everything else has to stop at that level. Well, we found the American people found when they founded the nation that there were certain rights that were elemental, and those rights ended up in the Bill of Rights, and there's others as well. But those rights ended up there because they recognized that without those rights, you don't have a free society. As a matter of fact, when you take religious liberty, for example, it turns out that religious liberty in the best research across the globe correlates very strongly with other rights. So if you don't have religious liberty, you probably don't have economic freedom. If you don't have religious liberty, you probably don't have women's rights, and vice versa. If you have it, you probably have those other rights.
Oh, great point, yeah.
Yeah, so these things, and this is the Pew Research Forum and others have done this research, and it's very extensive. So there are some rights that are more fundamental and elemental, and that includes religious freedom. And you want to make sure that you don't protect it, because it's a very dangerous and oppressive thing to begin messing with people's consciences. It turns out that the more restrictions that you put upon people's consciences, the more likely you are to have social hostility, and the more likely you are to have violence, all the rest of those things. So we really want to be careful that we understand what those are. At the same time, there's no reason that we can't accommodate other rights that may seem to be in conflict, and part of it is making sure that we give individuals the right and the freedom. There's ways, just almost like a market forces, to give options and creative thinking and innovative ways to accommodate both rights. That's what the political process does at its best. And then the courts are supposed to be there as a backstop to make sure that the political process doesn't get into a position of beginning to trample on one right or another. But the court should not be giving absolute rights to anybody. That's just not the way it works. It works in a way that we have to balance these things in a proper manner. So it's not an easy question, but it needs to be worked out on a case-by-case basis, partly on the basis of experience. We don't want, there are about 220 million Americans in this country who identify with a particular religious tradition. That's adults. We don't want whatever percentage of those that may be to begin being treated as if they were somehow second-class citizens or anything of that type. That leads to enormous social division and strife. We have to figure out. The Kentucky legislature has to figure this out. Congress has to figure this out. Every legislature has to figure this out. And one other side note is the Supreme Court put us on this course in 1990 when it issued a very bad decision about religious freedom called Employment Division v. Smith in 1990. In fact, what it did is it lowered the protections for religious freedom, so it threw all these questions into the political realms where the courts were supposed to be the backstop, protecting these rights and making sure that these types of things didn't happen, so that Kim Davis could appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would have some type of basis for saying, well, she does need a reasonable accommodation, which is what Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says for people in religion. So the court put us on this course. When it did that, immediately Congress enacted the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993, and it did so with only 3 negative votes because people recognized at that time that we were on the course to some type of conflicts over religious freedom. No one knew that it was going to be over same-sex marriage. No one knew it would be over LGBT rights.
But they knew it would be somewhere.
They knew it would be somewhere. We were on a collision course starting on the day that decision was issued. So the court did us no favors there. It was a really ill-fated decision, ill-conceived decision, and now we're kind of stuck for the time being in trying to get these rights protected in the political realm.
So the answer to my question is we don't know yet.
We don't know yet.
But we're going to find out if the legislatures decide to act on this. Brian, a really great way of looking at this morning. I appreciate you giving us some history and a breakdown on this. I hope we can do it again very soon. Really good stuff.
I'd love to very much. It's been good to be on.
Brian, it's been good having you on. Thank you so much. Have a great Labor Day weekend, and we'll look forward to talking soon.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you. Bryan Walsh with us here this morning. Really an interesting look from kind of a factual standpoint and a little bit more fact-based, if you will. Bryan Walsh, the founder and president of the Civil Rights Research Center, op-ed in The Hill yesterday, by the way, if you want to check that out.